My name is Alastair Jones, the full, sometimes called Dr. Jones by some of my friends who used to know a song from a very long time ago by Aqua. But yeah, so I'm Alastair Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of Frontier Youth Trust. I studied in 1996, and I studied on something called the Oasis Youth Ministry course, and I did a certificate in education back in those days in youth work. So it was the equivalent of doing the first year of university, and it took us 2 years to do that. We did a practice as part of that as well, and it was validated by the University of Wales and Spurgeon's College, I think. So it's a long time ago. Very different mechanisms now. So when we were at college, our timetable for the week looked something like 2 days a week in college. We were running a youth centre down in Worthing on the south coast for the Salvation Army, and we were studying as a part of that. So we'd come up on a Tuesday, early train in the morning, spend the day. Probably the first day we would either do theological study or practical study, and then the next day we'd do something different. My mum and dad lived in London, so we were able to stay overnight in London, so that was helpful. And then the rest of the week was involved a variety of things, from delivering a youth club through to working with the youth team, doing some work on discipleship with the young people in the church, but also doing outreach work into the schools. We were part of a group that did lots of work in the different schools in Worthing, assemblies, schools lessons, being in the Salvation Army. We used to get asked to show people around the church and show them what the different magic bits are in the church, and teach them to play a trombone quite often, and then a variety of other things as well as being involved on a Sunday, often be involved in preaching and taking the youth group, doing social things in the evening, or going to regional youth worship events and all that sort of thing. I know for me, certainly the thing I enjoyed the most was working in that open context, working with young people who just hadn't ever come across church, or didn't have a real solid connection with church, and there's that opportunity to spend time getting to know them and helping them to achieve new things, and to just have adults that were interested in them, that weren't necessarily their teacher or policeman or something like that. So they actually had youth workers who were helping, who were there for them, who were in their corner, and that made me quite excited about doing youth work. And it's fair to say, I think the way my approach to youth work over the years has changed an awful lot from when I first started, and when I knew all the answers and everything was black and white, and now I've just got far more questions than I have answers, and things are a lot more different scale grayscale tones, from very, very dark grey to slightly lighter white. I seem to remember the way that the college course was structured was that we had one day that was generally theological or some kind of biblical studies, and then another day that was geared towards practice and learning about our practice and ways to innovate or to do things in a different way. The other thing that we did, I remember the one thing quite clearly, was kind of formational groups, which for me, I was a scientist before I came into youth work, and when I was volunteering as a part-time volunteer youth worker, I was sort of studying at a university in science. It was a very different kind of way of learning for me. So to come into a sessional sort of youth work program and to ask about, well, what do I think about that, and reflecting on things and taking that stock and iterating and thinking about ways of which our work can be different, and we can improve that work, and also what it does for us and how we felt about that, and what that meant for the young people that we were working with. I thought that was really exciting. That was very different from a lot of the things that I'd learned about in science, because in science it's either black, it's either A or B, or it's a different model, or we can postulate things, or all of that. But it was a very different sort of world for me to kind of look at how human beings worked. Doing the course, we did some theological courses, practical courses. I remember there being quite a lot of guest speakers. There was always a day with Steve. I remember that every year there was a day with Steve, which kind of pretty much everyone came in and had loads of questions for him about that, and that was quite interesting, because at the time Oasis was still quite early days, really. The college has been going a little while, but not that long, and Oasis have been going a little bit longer, but again, lots of new things on the horizon. But it was really interesting to kind of hear from his perspective as to how his vision was going to be worked out, and what that might look like. So that was really interesting. We had some really creative people came in that were really inspiring. I remember doing a day on worship and creative worship, with someone called Johnny Baker, who I've since been able to link up with in my new job at Frontier Youth Trust. He's a real pioneer, works for the CMS at the moment, just a day with him listening to drum and bass and putting that to music and video and visuals, something which was completely out of my frame of reference from a fairly traditional church that majored more on brass bands and tambourines than perhaps drum and bass and audio visual work. So yeah, it was great, and just that kind of real practical engagement with tangible stuff like passing around fruit and experiencing that and what that meant to us as human beings and relating to that, rather than sitting on a sort of fairly static wooden pew receiving or communicating back in a transactional way. That kind of interactive presence was just really exciting and dynamic.